This is House Planning Help, episode 379. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up, my guest is architect Stephanie Kyle from Floyd Slaski Architects. In the last session, we talked about accessibility. Today, we're focusing on inclusive design. What is it and why does it matter? Stephanie is an inclusive design consultant and also a neurodiversity specialist. So we're going to dig into this topic today. Now, what do you want to know about on the podcast? It's ongoing, really. There's always content in the pipeline and I chug along, I make my best guess, but you are there right now doing things, planning things, in the midst of things. So what would you like to know about? And it could be something very specific, how a straw panel system works, or you want to know more about hemp insulation or a part of the building regulations. Or it could be a common challenge. A lot of us find land is an issue or it's too expensive. How can we make it cheaper or uncover the plot that everyone else is not looking at? It's not easy. Or maybe it's about how you build up a decent team, a team you can rely on, or budgeting, or whatever it might be. You tell me. I like to stay in contact and have my finger on the pulse. So we've got a contact form on our website, houseplanninghelp.com. I'd appreciate it if you just come and tell me how things are going, where you are in the process and what you would like to know about. houseplanninghelp.com/contact. Let's get to our featured interview with Stephanie Kyle. We're looking at inclusive design, and I started by asking Stephanie to tell me a little bit about herself and how she came to work in architecture.
When I was a kid, I was diagnosed with something called auditory processing disorder, which is a neurodivergent condition. And we had an architect come into our school, and as part of their planning and tick box exercises, they had to say that they'd done some stakeholder engagement with the public. So they came into our school and was like, what do you want this new aquarium in your town to be like? And we did the workshops with them and we told them all of our ideas, and then they built it and it was absolutely atrocious. We went on a school trip there. And I thought, do you know what, I could do a better job of that myself. So I decided to be an architect, went to university, did all of that, and ended up going down the inclusive design route. That started off primarily because I'd already been diagnosed with one neurodivergent condition. I didn't actually realise I was autistic until I was in my 20s. I was late diagnosed. But every single project I'd done up until that point, all throughout my education and my thesis and everything, was on inclusive design, so designing for disability, gender, religion, everything that's considered a protected characteristic under the Equality Act. And my specialism is in neurodiverse, inclusive design and non-visible disabilities. So specifically focusing on how we can design better for things like dementia, autism, ADHD, and all of the non-visible conditions as well. So things like epilepsy or chronic pain conditions, because there are multiple ways that we can design for those as well.
You've already mentioned so many interesting things, but let's just stick with that late diagnosis to begin with, because I imagine this is going to be a common situation for people. So how did that change your life?
Fortunately for me, because I'd already had the diagnosis of the first neurodivergent condition, I had assumed that everything that made me autistic, all of the characteristics I have, all of the traits I have, I assumed that they was because of the APD, so auditory processing disorder, or APD for short. So I was fortunate enough to go through life fairly unmasked and fairly supported. So I got some support at college and at university because of it. Whereas a lot of people that are late diagnosed don't have those privileges. So they grow up having to mask quite heavily, and masking being pretending to fit in or trying to hide parts of yourself that society don't find comfortable or find strange or weird or something like that. And obviously nothing about an autistic person is strange or weird, but it's just the way that society perceives some autistic behaviours. So for me, I grew up fairly unmasked, so I'm incredibly blunt. Anybody will tell you who works with me that I'm just straight to the point. I don't beat around the bush because it saves time that way. But being late diagnosed just meant that I had that confirmation. So I obviously do still have APD, but that's secondary to the autism. So getting the late diagnosis kind of just confirmed that I really aren't weird, and it is just the way my brain is. And all of those extra things that I didn't know about or that I wondered about, it was just nice to have that shiny piece of paper confirming by somebody else, yep, you definitely are autistic.
Yeah, because we're talking about buildings today, specifically houses. Either perhaps a new house might be built or an existing property retrofitted and altered. And so, given some of these situations, presumably people are just living in whatever property life has thrown at them.
Yeah, so that's the same with all buildings, to be honest. So all of the built environment is built predominantly by neurotypical people for neurotypical people. So sometimes there's a misconception that if we design for well-being and design for mental health, that benefits neurodivergent people, so like autistic people and people with ADHD, for example. But in reality, it does have a positive effect, but that's not because of the neurodivergence. It's because people that are neurodivergent often have worse mental health because they are living in an entire world that is not designed for them. Everything in our environment is designed for the neurotypical population. So things that would make neurotypical people stressed or also make neurodivergent people stressed, but then they have the additional environmental stresses of lights that are too bright, noises that are too loud, patterns that are too bold, everything that's just not suited to a neurodivergent sensory profile.
So what about where you live right now? You know yourself, it sounds like you're actually very confident. What does that mean for your house?
Yep, so for me personally, I cannot stand any noise whatsoever. So my office is soundproofed. I have speakers to play my music when I want to. So I have full control of my environment. I control the light. So I have light filtration blinds as well as blackout blinds. So I can control the glare that comes in, the intensity of the light. I have colour changing lights. I have basically full control of my environment. I have individual thermostats in each room, depending on what I need. All of the colours that I've picked are obviously colours that I've chosen that I'm comfortable with that make me feel a certain way. So I have different colours in different rooms. So my office, for example, the background in my office is quite vibrant, but I'm not looking at it. That's more for when I'm in meetings and things like that to keep the background entertaining and somewhat designy for everybody else who's looking at it in the back of my video. But the wall I stare at is completely blank, but it's not white because white is very reflective, especially brilliant white. All of the colours that I'm looking at are lower chroma, which I'll talk about later. They are a lot lower intensity. So I control the patterns and the boldness in my own environment so that it's suited to where I need it. So for example, when I'm cooking, my kitchen is quite higher energy because that takes a lot out of me. So having a more energized space to do those kind of activities helps me a lot more. Whereas the spaces where I need to be completely calm and quiet and grounded, the colour tone and the colour palettes in those rooms are designed for that reason, for me, for my personal preference.
What if we're coming into this and we're a client and we don't really know what we want? Did you always know what you wanted, or was this an evolution?
It's difficult talking about me as an individual compared to everybody else as a whole, because if you've met one autistic person, then you've met one autistic person. Everybody's completely different. There's a big misconception that autism is like what it is in the movies, where it's typically like a 9-year-old boy rocking in the corner playing with trains and he screams if you touch him. That's obviously not what autistic people are like in real life. Yeah, there will be a handful of people that match that stereotype exactly, but everybody's completely different. So the sensory needs that I have are going to be very, very different to the sensory needs that other people have. So when we're talking about designing spaces for public, so where you've got a lot of different people using the same space and you don't know somebody's very specific needs or very specific environmental requirements, we have to design for the majority as much as we can. But by the majority, I don't mean the neurotypical majority, I mean the majority of neurodivergent people. So in those kind of situations, we would look at using lower chroma colour palettes. We have to think about visual contrast and things like that as well. One of the main things that we try and do is start off with a lower sensory environment for the primary surfaces. So things that you can't change easily, like walls and floors. You can't change those easily. You can't change your bricks on a house very easily without knocking the whole thing down. So those things that are more permanent should be as muted and as natural and as calming as possible. And then you add in boldness in removable features or things that can be changed really easily. So you can very easily swap out a bright zigzag multicolored rug for a different one, but you can't swap out a multicolored zigzag floor. So in houses and things like that, we would always recommend using anything that's like a tiled floor or a kitchen splashback, trying to keep those muted. And yeah, you can still have feature colours and designer elements to them, but if you keep those lower chroma, lower intensity, and then you can add in that vibrance as and when you need it. Because the other thing to point out is that people's needs will change on a daily basis or on a weekly basis or person to person. So you can't just rely on providing a completely calming environment, because what if you've got a house, for example, you've got one autistic kid and one ADHD kid, and one person needs more sensory input and one person needs sensory recovery, so less sensory input. You've got to be able to adapt spaces to suit everybody, to suit different needs. You might even find that one person in a morning needs more energizing spaces, and then in an evening needs less energizing spaces, more calming spaces. So that flexibility is things like your furnishings that can be swapped over quite easily.
And I know you work in the commercial sector, but would there be someone who could assist us with homes and how we might address those? Because I'm imagining your conventional architect is not going to have the experience.
Conventional architects, even in the commercial sector, don't have experience in inclusive design. That's why we have inclusive design consultants like myself who go in and help out. So, for example, all architects know a little bit about fire engineering, they know a little bit about acoustic engineering, about lighting design, but then they would still go to an acoustic engineer to help them with the very specific details of managing that, or they would go to a fire consultant to help with the specific details around fire safety. It's the same kind of principles with inclusive design as well. So standard architects, they'd be at university for a lot longer if they ended up having to know everything that an inclusive design consultant does as well. So even in the commercial sector, it's not something that you're going to find very easily. So in the private sector, looking at houses, architects are not going to have that kind of experience. There are lots of resources out there, but with individual housing requirements, what the best strategy would be is speaking to the clients about their specific day-to-day, things that they find challenging in their day-to-day, things that they would like to be improved, and then it's up to the architect to work out how they go about designing the space to suit that individual client.
So can you take us through the design process? What would it look like from the brief to developing the designs, and when is input useful?
Yeah, so I'll talk more about commercial because that's the one that I do, but I will also explain how the same things transfer across to residential. So our design process, it starts off, so you have stage 0 to 1, which is your briefing stage. So that's helping the client work out exactly what their brief is, because they might come to you saying they want one thing, but then when you talk them through it and when you find out what a day in the life of that building is, or what a client's routine is or something, it may be that there might be a different solution. So in commercial, it might be that the client wants, let's say, a hospital ward and they want it just to be painted and redecorated and just change the finishes. But then when you speak to them and learn about how some of the operations on the day-to-day of using that ward actually don't work very well, you might be able to work with the client to say, actually, we think that instead of focusing on this, you should probably change your focus and look at doing this instead, because that's going to have the biggest impact long-term on the use of the ward. Similarly with housing, a client might decide that they want a new build or that they want something very specific doing for their house. But then when you speak to them about it, it might make sense once you've talked through the process, talk through what their family routine is, the things they do day to day, the things that they like about their space, the things that they don't like about the space, the things that they want. You might find that actually you can get away with just replanning some internal walls and still achieve the results that they want. So it would always start with that briefing phase, checking that the brief is correct in the first place and seeing if there's any improvements or enhancements that you can make to better suit the client's needs, regardless of whether they're commercial or residential. Then stage 2 is the concept design stage, where we come up with something, we put some mood boards together, some initial designs, just so the client can get a feel of what's going to happen and make sure it's all on the right track. We would consult stakeholders at every single stage. So for commercial buildings, we speak to stakeholder groups at the briefing stage, at concept design stage, and then at future stages as well. And by stakeholder groups, we don't mean the people that are paying for it. We mean the people that are going to be using the building day in, day out. So in the example of a hospital, we would not be speaking to the estates team. Obviously, they would be involved, but for stakeholder engagement workshops, the focus would be the staff and the patients, because they're the people that are going to be using the space day in, day out, whereas the people paying for it typically don't get involved that much with life on the ward. So the next stage would be detailed design, where that concept design kind of becomes a little bit more real and we start thinking about not only a general idea of how things are going to look, but working out the logistics of it and making sure that it's possible. We think about spatial planning. This is the point where we would start to put proper areas together of spaces, looking at the way that all of the smaller details come together. And then stage 4 is technical design stage, which is where we start to work out how to actually build this. So at stage 4, that's when we would start preparing construction details so that then the builders know exactly how to build it. We would start coordinating more with other services like the structural engineer, the electrical engineer, mechanical engineer, to make sure everything is going as it should be and coordinating all of those services. So, for example, we'd be looking at drainage routes to make sure that none of the drainage pipes are going to crash into anything else that we've got planned. Stage 5 is construction stage, so that's getting it built. So by that point, all of the details would have been done, kind of like an IKEA instruction manual for the builders, so that they can just start building it on site. There are 2 more stages as well. Stage 6 is handover, which is when everything's handed over to the client and they go through a period of testing and making sure that everything is working exactly as they want it. There's normally like a defects period there as well, so we check that nothing's broken or that nothing is broken quickly that needs to be replaced. And then after that is stage 7, which is in use, which is kind of where we do some feedback and evaluation. So we go into past projects, we speak to the clients and say, like, maybe even years on, and find out whether the design actually works for them, and we do lessons learned, so we find out things that could be improved for future projects.
So having adaptable spaces, is that quite a positive thing? You've mentioned a couple of times how you don't want to be messing with the fabric of the building or anything that's fixed. So is that a guiding principle?
Yeah, so adaptable spaces are essential, well, especially after COVID, because during the pandemic, everybody had to work from home and everybody realised this space is absolutely awful. I'm in a 3-bedroom house. I can't work anywhere. I'm ended up having to work at the dining table, especially if you've got 2 people working from home at the same time and then all the kids are off. They're not at school. So people were realising during the pandemic that houses just aren't working at all. That's the cause right now of a lot of people trying to redesign their spaces because everything's different. And we've now got flexible working. A lot of people are working remotely and working from home, for example. So having adaptable spaces in the first place, if our housing stock was already somewhat adaptable and included things like somewhere that somebody could work from an office, or rather than having to repurpose one of the bedrooms, if there's a designated space already built in, that would be ideal. Or if we had houses that were already organised so that it's easy to have a kids' play space and a kids' learning space for the times that they have to learn from home rather than going to school.
Just going back to your own situation, because you're going to know a lot of details about your house. When we talk about soundproofing, was that a big job or was that done by the fabric of the building? Say, for example, in the passive house world, just because you're increasing the air tightness and what have you, they are instinctively more soundproof, or are we talking within the separation within the building, or how might that work?
Passive house and new build houses are instinctively more soundproofed. My house is a 1960s house that I bought and started renovating. It had not been touched since the day it was built, so it needed a lot of work doing to it. One of the things we started doing was insulating the ground floor, the subfloor underneath it. My office in particular has a separate acoustic lining that we put in, so it was really, really simple, really easy to do. You can buy acoustic insulation boards, you can buy acoustic notice boards, like as a very minor thing. You can pick them up off the shelf and just stick them straight on the wall and they'll contribute to the acoustic noise reduction. Things like floor finish changes, so you can buy LVTs or luxury vinyl tiles with specific underlays. So rubber underlay, for example, is more soundproof than other types of acoustic underlay. So even if you went onto B&Q's website, look at different flooring underlays, they all have the noise reduction ratings on there. So typically anything that reduces the sound by 14 decibels or more is going to be a significant improvement over such a large space. You can add acoustic absorption into lots of other things, like even your lampshades. Typically any materials that are soft, any soft furnishing, so large curtains. Go for floor-to-ceiling draping curtains that are thick. You can also get additional curtain linings to reduce acoustic absorption. If you want to go a bit more DIY, you can add another wall lining to the existing wall with a small stud frame and fill that full of mineral wool or fill that through with high-density foam. In my house, personally, I went for mineral wool because it's inert, so it's non-flammable no matter what. So that's in my subground floor, which was easy to do. I just went underneath in the crawl space and stapled it to the underneath of the floorboards with some netting. There's so many ways you can improve the space acoustically. And then going on to adapting and improving your spaces in terms of lighting, you can get obviously regular blinds, blackout blinds, but you can get double blinds where they've got a light filtration blind as well as the blackout. So that means if the sun's coming through and it's really, really bright and the intensity of that light is too much, you can get the light filtration blinds, which you can even buy them separately where they sit inside the window opening to just reduce that and to control that and give you a bit more control of the light in your space.
So when we started this conversation, you actually ran through a number of different areas that you might deal with in your work. So could you just remind us of those, and or even going into some of the differences within neurodiversity, but just breaking up some of these so we understand a bit more about them?
Yeah, so the main thing about neurodiversity is sensory processing. So I'll go back a step further. So we have 3 neurocognitive profiles. We have neurotypical, which is what the majority of the population relate to. They have a neurotypical neurocognitive profile. Lots of words that start with neuro. So that essentially means the majority. Then we have neurodivergent, which means that the neurocognitive profile is just different from the majority of the population. And then the third one is neurodegenerative, which is where your brain structure changes or rewires itself over time due to a degenerative disease or a brain disease like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. So all of these neurocognitive profiles essentially just means the way that your brain is set up, the instruction manual that your brain had when it was forming. And the thing that neurodivergent and neurodegenerative brains have in common is a difference in sensory processing. So sensory processing is the way that your brain takes in, receives information, processes it, labels it, filters it. And obviously with the senses, we've got the main 5, which everybody's aware of, which is sight, hearing, smell, taste and touch. But then there are 3 extra ones. Well, there are a few extra ones, but the 3 extra ones that relate to the built environment the most are your sense of proprioception, which is your grip strength, your hand-eye coordination. It's essentially where your body is in relation to itself. So if you've ever heard the term that somebody's heavy-handed, it just means they've got a different sense of proprioception. We've also got vestibular sense, which is your sense of where your body is in relation to the space around you. So that's being able to sense if you're in a lift and you're moving up or down, being able to sense if you're in a car and you're speeding up or slowing down, or if you're spinning or something like that. It's also the sense that causes car sickness. So if somebody has an overactive vestibular sense, they're more likely to be car sick. And then the last one is interoception, which is the sense of what's going on internally in your own body. So it's being able to sense if you're tired, being able to sense if you're hungry, if you need to go to the toilet. So neurotypical people sense these things in a neuromajority way, but then people that are neurodivergent or have a neurodegenerative condition like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's process these things differently. That's all it means. It's just a different way of processing it. You can also experience a temporary sensory processing difference. So this example, which hopefully a lot of people are familiar with, I'll give you a couple of examples, is being drunk. So if you are drunk, the way that you perceive your environment visually is different. The speed at which you process it is different. The way that you speak, the way that you move, the way that you think is different in that moment. Your sense of balance and coordination, you're going to get dizzy. That's also different temporarily. Or if you have a migraine, all of the lights are really, really bright when you've got a migraine, or all of the sounds are really, really loud when you've got a migraine. So that's your brain processing that sensory information differently. They're both temporary examples. Now, some people with sensory processing differences, being neurodivergent, experience those kind of things all the time. And it's not all of the senses all at once necessarily, and it varies person to person. But just to give you an example, processing all of that information, if somebody is autistic, they might be hypersensitive to sound. So they might experience sounds a lot louder, the same way that somebody with a migraine or a hangover is experiencing all of those sounds really, really loud. It might be like that all the time. And that's why something as simple as a hand dryer going off can be such a massive trigger for somebody who is hypersensitive to noise. Another one that's really, really common is visual processing. So a neurodivergent person's sense of visual processing is going to be very different. So they might perceive colours to be significantly more intense that to somebody who is neurotypical or to somebody who doesn't have a visual sensory processing difference. They may perceive the contrast in colours to be different. Like if you've got any really bold patterns or striking patterns, so stripes, zigzags, any high contrast patterns, they might look like they're moving. It might look like an optical illusion all the time. So that might not bother somebody who's neurotypical, but it might really, really bother somebody who's neurodivergent. When we're designing spaces for people, we have to think about both hypersensitive and hypersensitive. So people that are bothered by all of these things because their brain cannot filter things out. Their brains perceive colours to be too bright, sounds to be too noisy. But we also have to think about people that are hypersensitive, so people that need more stimulation. So I'll give you another example. So I already mentioned that me being autistic, my personal environmental preferences are I need complete silence to work. I cannot concentrate if I can't hear a pin drop. My brother has ADHD. He is the exact opposite. If it's silent in a room, he can't get anything done. He can't concentrate. Whereas if he goes and sits in a cafe where he's got some background noise, some hustle and bustle going on, he can focus absolutely fine there. That's the environment that he needs. Some people to sleep also need absolute silence, whereas some people need to play background music or some brown noise or white noise or something like that to help them to sleep. So that's an example of sensory seeking because you need more sensory stimulation to be able to regulate and concentrate.
Well, that's really good. You've covered a lot of ground there, and I have more questions. I don't know where to start. What about, you mentioned earlier on some of the different senses that we have. So even things like smell or taste, does that come into play in everyday life?
Yep. So after your visual sense, smell is, or your olfactory sense, is the most powerful in terms of wayfinding and navigation. If you don't have the ability to see temporarily or permanently, your sense of smell is actually the one that gets you around most. And people wouldn't think that that's what it would be, but it is. So we can do strategic things like, especially when we're designing commercial buildings, we can plan for strategic planting of different flowers and plants that have different scents and put them at different ends of the building. So when in combination with the prevailing winds, so winds coming in from the northeast or the southwest, they carry those scents through. We could also do things like strategically placing cafes in certain locations so that the scent of the food and smells and things like that, they can also play into it. And that's not necessarily always a positive thing. Sometimes we have to place cafes and food smells strategically so that you don't get those extra overwhelming smells, because obviously some people are going to find it incredibly overpowering, and then we have to go the opposite way and put in extra ventilation systems and scent filtration systems in and things like that. So yes, you absolutely can design for smell. Taste is a very hard one to design for. I can't think of any examples. The only thing there would be using low VOC paints and non-chemical things, because some children with autism, for example, or some people with dementia tend to want to explore the sensory environment with their mouth by putting things in their mouth. So we would use low VOC non-toxic paints and chemicals and materials just in case if anybody were to start trying to sensory seek in a way that's putting things in your mouth, then it's not going to cause any problems. Same with planting. For landscape design, we would never use anything that is toxic to humans or animals, because obviously you're going to have assistance dogs and things like that as well. So just in case anybody does have some sensory exploration in that way, it's not going to be a problem.
So this is almost another lens that designers and architects, they may not even have this lens, but I imagine you will be able to tell me some no-nos, some things that go drastically wrong. So do you have a couple of examples just to open our mind a bit?
Yeah, so absolutely. One thing I'll start off with designers is that if you've got, let's say, an architect or an interior designer or even a client, if they have a family member or themselves who has a very specific diagnosis, let's say we've got an architect and they have a daughter who is epileptic. That architect is going to be thinking about epilepsy in everything that they design. They're going to be thinking about things like any vertical shadows that are going to be created, any flicker effects or strobing effects that are going to be created from patterns or lighting situations. So they will think about that in everything that they design. If you've got a kid who is in a wheelchair, you're going to think about that in everything that you do. But you're not going to think about all of the other things and all of the other different conditions. And it's impossible to know about all of them. It's kind of my job to know about as many as possible, but I don't know all of them. So whenever I meet somebody with a disability that I've not encountered before, I ask them so many questions about what would make the environment better for them so that I'm armoured with more knowledge for the next time. I always encourage people to know enough to ask the right questions rather than trying to know everything that there is to know. That means basically being able to work out whether you need to consult other people with lived experience. So part of my job is to arrange stakeholder engagement meetings with people with lived experience. So that means that they've got the experience of having that specific disability or that specific characteristic. So rather than relying on my experience as one adult with autism, if I'm designing an SEND school for lots of children with autism, I'm going to speak to the kids with autism because that's very different to my experience. Some big no-nos that happen quite a lot, using high intensity colour. That's one of the ones that I try and avoid. Oh, actually, I've got the best example possible is manifestation. So in England and Wales, we have the building regulations, and one section of that is about protection from falling, but it also includes protection from walking into large windows and pieces of glazing as well. So when you see any large pieces of glass, normally it has something on it called manifestation, which is like some little translucent white dots to kind of tell you that this is a piece of glass, don't walk into it. Now, manifestation is always wrong. There's very, very, very few instances where it's done correctly. The biggest no-no is people using white transparent manifestation, because what you have to do is make sure that it contrasts with the background in both directions in all weather conditions. And when you use translucent manifestation, especially translucent white manifestation, that's impossible. It doesn't work. But on drawings, when they're submitting for building control approval, the building control inspectors just see that when it's drawn in 2D with black and white lines, it looks like it's there. It looks like it's going to be fine. But then in real life, when it's built, it doesn't work. Clear opening door widths is another one that's probably relevant to housing too. Well, it's relevant to all buildings. So you have to have certain widths that are available when you've got a door that's open. So if you open a door, first of all, you have something to the side of it, which is your leading edge clear space. And that basically is enough space to be able to maneuver to open the door. And sometimes the doors are too close to a return wall, and that makes it really difficult to do. So if you've got your hands full of shopping, let's say you've just been to Tesco's and you've done a big shop and you're trying to carry all the bags at once rather than make 2 trips to the car, you might find you have to use your foot to open the door. And you wouldn't be able to do that if you didn't have that leading edge space. That space is there primarily for people who are wheelchair users to be able to open the door and to operate and open it. But like I say, everybody benefits from it with the Tesco example. That space there, that clear width opening space of your door as well, always ends up being smaller than people think it needs to be. So they look at the numbers that are in the building regulations and pick a door that matches that kind of size. But then when it's actually built with all the construction tolerances and you take off the thickness of the door and the ironmongery, it doesn't actually work. So the key thing is providing enough space at concept design and at detailed design stage that when things are actually built on site with all the construction tolerances and all the extra boxings that you've had to put in because the structural engineer wants another column or because the drainage route means you've got another pipe there, you have to leave enough space early on so that even with all those small minor changes later on down the line, things still work. So you've got to kind of see into the future a little bit.
What about building regulations then? What is written into the building regulations?
So with the building regulations, they are very broad and very general so that it's easier for buildings to pass and for buildings to be compliant. Because if they were too onerous, it would be really, really difficult to get things built, especially when you've got different site constraints or really difficult things to deal with, like existing buildings and things. So the actual building regulations themselves, the main part that you have to achieve is that all people should be able to use all parts of the building. They should be able to access it and operate everything within it in the same way. So that means that a disabled person, for example, should be able to access and operate the building in the same way that an able-bodied person would be able to. So that means not putting an accessible entrance all the way around the back on the other side, or putting in window controls that require 2 hands to operate them, because not everybody's going to be able to have the dexterity or the control to do that. That's why things like touchscreens, things like app-controlled devices for lighting controls and things like that, they're all really beneficial. There is a guide called Part M, Approved Document Part M, which sets out things like physical dimensions and some requirements in terms of visual contrast to try and find one way to kind of achieve that. So the ultimate thing that you have to achieve is that everybody has to be able to access and operate the building. The approved documents are then just like one way to kind of achieve that. So you don't have to comply with it fully, and a lot of the time that doesn't happen. There is other guidance. There's a guide called BS8300, which is significantly better. It goes into a lot more detail. It talks about what things are important and why they're important. So it explains the difficulties that people might have with certain things. So, for example, it explains that an oven height should have the centre line at 900 to a metre off the finished floor level, because if it's any lower or higher, it's going to be really difficult for somebody who is a wheelchair user to be able to operate it. Whereas if you put it at that exact height, that's going to be a lot better and will suit a wide range of people. So rather than it just telling you, put an oven at 900 to 1000 mil off the floor, it tells you why you need to do that. So that's beneficial. There is a third piece of documentation which is free called the PAS 6463, which is designed for the mind. Now, this is a guidance document specifically about neurodiversity and specifically about designing for neurocognitive differences and sensory processing differences. The good thing about this one is it goes into lots of detail on those things, but the downside to it is it doesn't tell you how to achieve it. It just says these things are problems. You should probably work out how to achieve it from there. So it kind of tells you what the problems are, but not how to fix it. And then it's up to the individual designer to work out.
So inclusivity does seem to be a key word in this space. So are things getting better?
Yep. So inclusivity and inclusive design, it's not only disability. Obviously, that's primarily what we're talking about here. And it's also primarily because disability is the easiest characteristic for the built environment to respond to, because there's not really much that buildings can do in terms of marriage equality. Well, essentially, it means everything that's protected under the Equality Act. So it also includes things like religion and gender. And those are other things that we can design for, especially in public buildings. In terms of inclusive design in general, the UK is doing really, really well. We are one of the leaders in the world for this kind of topic, especially for neurodiversity. We're really leading the way, especially compared to some of the other countries. You'd think that it might be some of the Scandinavian countries, but they're very, very good at design for well-being and for mental health, but not necessarily disability and inclusion.
What about further resources, further reading? Who do we turn to?
My best advice would be speak to people with lived experience, because that's going to be so much more enriching and so much more insightful than consulting guidance or papers written by people with one viewpoint perspective. So social media is incredibly powerful at seeing other people's experiences and other people's lived experience and learning about it from their perspectives. So again, myself as a disabled person, I have experience on my disabilities, but I would still speak to other people with different perspectives if I was designing for somebody else, because my experience does not trump theirs.
How would you like to close up our chat today? Either repeating something from the conversation that's really important or something else that we've missed?
So whenever I'm doing a presentation or a CPD or talking to people like this, I always like to finish up with my political correctness things. So these are just some things to remember, some key terms, just to kind of help the way that we speak to disabled people. So the first thing I want to say is that disabilities can be dynamic. So that means that some days you might see somebody using a walking aid, or you might see somebody using a wheelchair, and then a different day they might not be using it at all. And that does not mean that they're faking it. It doesn't mean that there's anything else going on there. It just means that disabilities are dynamic. And this also applies to neurodiversity. So people can have really, really good days and really, really bad days. Another thing I like to mention is that disability and disabled are not bad words. Disabled people aren't Voldemort. We don't need to avoid saying them. Things like differently abled, or saying that autism is a superpower or something like that. All of these things are condescending and not progressive. They're not helpful. The thing that is helpful is acknowledging that disabled people exist, that we are living in a world that is not designed for us. So disabled people are disabled by the environment, typically, Because if the world and all the buildings were set up properly to be inclusive for everybody, then there wouldn't be as many problems with operating and navigating and using the built environment. Just because somebody has an illness or condition doesn't mean they're suffering. So please don't say she suffers with autism. I don't. I'm having a great time. All architects and designers under the ARB Code of Conduct have a duty of care to everybody, to the end users, no matter their religion, gender, disability, everything. So that's not to the person who's paying you. It's to the end users, and that's the most important user group you can get involved with everything. So that's for housing design. The most important person is the people that are going to be using that building, the people that are going to be living in the house. What's your routine like? What's your challenges? What things would make the space better for you? You don't have to think about what makes it better for everybody in general or the most copy and paste solution. What do you need to make it bespoke?
Well, Stephanie, really appreciate all the information you've shared with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Get more in the show notes today, which you can find at houseplanninghelp.com/379. We've got a summary waiting for you there so you can reflect on this conversation. Maybe you've got a comment. Either you can head down to the bottom of the show notes and there's a place to interact there, or you can head on to social media. We'll give you links for that. And of course, links to Stephanie and links to Floyd Slaski Architects, houseplanninghelp.com/379. My call to action is to check out the Hub, and this is the membership community that we run. We've just added a new part to the Kinver in-depth video case study. So this was a retrofit project of a Victorian mid-terrace property, and we're now back there 2 years on, and Guy is still in his shorts, which I like to see. It's a really positive story, and I suppose it's why you do this. It's why you spend the money on your house to get this great property at the end. So Alan Budden, I've dragged him back in on this as well from Eco Design Consultants, and you hear a catch up between the two of them, just reflecting on the whole journey. This was a COVID build as well, which added complication, and they had material price rises going through the roof and all the rest of it. But they came out the other side, the dust has settled, and there are quite a few learnings on this project, which we cover in this video. Also in the Hub, we've got Ask the Expert. If you have a burning question that you want answered, or maybe it's a course on a particular topic that you want to delve into, we've got the forum so you can get interactive with other members, or maybe you want to chat with me during office hour. It's all in there. Find out more at houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time, Heather Johnson from AD Practice is my guest. You've probably heard of the Passive House Standard, also known as Classic. But what is Passive House Plus? We'll find out next time. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media. Content that matters.